to a much more fun topic, and it's one that you're probably asked quite a bit. Trained individuals gaining muscle and losing fat simultaneously. I even get this question, and the way I approach it, and tell me if this is how you do it or you do it different, is I tell them to prioritize one or the other and work on that first. However, you can do both. So what say you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree 100%. I said, you know, just because you can doesn't mean you should, because you're going to get most benefit from doing one or the other, right? Trying to gain the muscle mass or losing the body fat. Of course, of importance when trying to lose the body fat is try to maintain as much muscle as you can. That being said, I do highlight, you know, who are you that you're talking to, right? Because it varies so much in the response. So, you know, if you have this obese individual who's sedentary, who's, you know, eating 2 meals a day, not eating enough protein, hasn't exercised since they were 15 years old, you know, that individual, you know, you get protein intake up to just 1.6 grams per kilo, you know, get them moving. Even an aerobic exercise program will put muscle mass on that individual,
right.
In some instances, right? So you put the weight training on top of that, and then it's going to improve. So I think it really kind of depends, you know, training status, training age. I think whether you're male or female, obviously, you know, your endogenous state, you know, what your hormones are producing. I think all of those things are going to definitely play an impact. And then I think the more things that you're doing right, the harder it is going to be to do both, right? So if you're already fairly lean, you know, if you've been training for 10, 15 years and you're 10% body fat, and you know, you've been weight training 4 or 5 days a week, and you've been eating enough, so you've been checking all the boxes for years and years, chances of you body recomping are going to be, you know, very minimal, right? And that's when it's most important to really prioritize. But when you're checking a lot of boxes wrong, and you haven't been doing a lot of these basic things that we know are important, and you incorporate them, then I think it's a very viable situation for them. And that being said, I think I kind of take advantage of that. So even if they are trying to, you know, let's say lose body fat primarily, the nice thing about that, if they're doing a lot of things wrong, I can just start them if they've been sedentary, start them exercising, get their protein intake up, increase fruit and vegetable intake. You know, all of a sudden I can actually get more water in them, all those things, get more rest. Now we add all of those things. I don't even have to put them in a deficit, and all of a sudden they lose body fat and gain muscle because they were doing so many things wrong. So that's how I approach it.
And Tony, like with the fight sports, obviously, if you're in a weight class, the last thing you want to do is actually gain lean body mass, unless you're in the heavyweight class. So for them, it's almost always maintaining a lean physique and or losing fat. Much different than the old days. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, watching old time fighters, a lot of them would just get fat between fights. I remember Roberto Duran, he would just get fat. Even Muhammad Ali would be like kind of chubby and out of shape between fights. But now, you know, obviously nutrition is better. So, you know, comment on how modern fighters now approach the body comp issue, because most of them don't think about gaining lean mass per se, but they don't obviously want to lose it.
No, they don't. And to be honest, you know, the preservation of it, when you look at the 10 to 12 weeks, gaining would be challenging, right? Because of the sheer training volumes, the multitude of biomotor stimulus. So, you know, it's not like you're just strength training. Yeah, you're doing strength training, but then you're almost punching some of that muscle off with the sheer volume in striking on a heavy bag, for example, for 500, 600, 7 times. But conversely, then the grappling is something genetically dependent, where some people put that muscle back. So I think first, regarding the lean tissue preservation or size, it's contingent upon the body type. So if you take a Volkanovski, for example, who fights featherweight and shorter than most opponents, he may still be more inclined to either hold that lean tissue or even add a little, depending upon the training stimulus, the sleep and the diet and so forth. Whereas somebody that might fight at 145 who's 6'1", obviously their body might have a greater propensity to rid that tissue. Right. So I think the preservation or the actual gaining is very genetically dependent, more than even the stimulus. However, to your point, one of the good things is that they are doing a better job right now, if you will, of staying within a reasonable range
Yes.
of their, their weight class. And I think they're progressing to stay at that 10% or under. We just did that paper, Dr. A, as you know, we were very surprised by this, Guillermo, that most of the best athletes are significantly lower in body weight prior to the 72 hours, 48 hours, and 24 hours to weight to the scale than we thought previously. And even some of those, we have much less data on this from the UFC, but some of those in the off season are staying within that 10% above body weight and below. So I think the sport has evolved, to Dr. Antonio's point, significantly, where they're kind of cognizant now of the fact they don't want to put themselves through hell and back, and they're reasonable about how much weight they're gaining in between. And once again, though, it's very, to your point, but very body type specific
Right.
too.
Now,
It's
sort of,
great that you guys are doing some of that stuff, because I mean, that's one thing for wrestlers and UFC fighters, boxers, that I see all the time. They're the old school method of losing 8-10% of their body weight in a 24 to 48 hour
Right.
period. And it's like it never made sense. So it's like, now stay within what what we call striking distance of your weight. So if you're gonna weigh in at 170, so stay within 175, 176. If you need to lose 2 or 3% of your body weight, overnight, that's doable without having deleterious effects on your performance. But if you have to lose 5 or 10% of your body weight, you're going to have some performance detriments potentially, I would imagine.
And that's spot on, particularly where the maintenance of weight is sustained, like the wrestling season. You might be able to get away with a little bit more if you're doing 3-4 cuts per year, and you have a 36-hour rehydration window like you do in professional fighting. But to your point, in collegiate wrestling, we got to keep those percentages much more right in the in the window of the 2 to 3%, as you know.
Absolutely.
now staying on the body composition issue, I want you to comment, Guillermo, on fasted versus non-fasted aerobic exercise, and then also when bodybuilders go through their diet refeeds and diet breaks, what's the physiology behind that? Because obviously it's a big part of bodybuilding training.
Yeah, absolutely. So so fasted versus fed cardio, that's one that the debate's been around, and I still hear it all the time. You still see a lot of trainers and fitfluencers recommend it, and to me, I was one that at first I was like, it doesn't work at all, and you see some of the evidence, and then I started to kind of like look at the caveats behind, and then it became kind of it might depend, and I still think there's a lot we don't know. I would say for probably 90% of the population, it really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's just caloric expenditure versus intake over the course of the day, the week, the month, etc., to be able to do that. So whether you're metabolizing fat or metabolizing carbs acutely is kind of irrelevant as to whether you're burning body fat at the end of the day. That being said, though, I think there's really, when we actually wrote a paper on this, and we looked at a narrative review, and we looked at the literature, a lot of acute studies, but okay, so we have some mechanistic potential things there, but then we started kind of let's look at some of the chronic studies, the training studies, and really there's only 5 that have been done, and actually of those, really only 1 has been done similarly to what would be prescribed in kind of a real life scenario, and that was done by Brad Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon, I think back in 2014. And if you look at that study, I think they were looking at, I can't believe it was females. I want to say they were track and field athletes, maybe basketball players, one or the other. I can't recall right off the top of my head. But anyway, they actually had they were actually dieting, so they were in a hypocaloric diet. So they're the only study that actually they measured body composition pre and post. Caveat there, they measure body composition with the BOD pod, so we have to look at what's the measurement error of that BOD pod, and the smallest detectable difference between those. So we have to put that in the back of our head. But they actually found that the group that did the fasted cardio did lose like a little bit more body fat, not statistically significant. It wasn't enough to reach statistical significance, and it might have been that measurement error of the bod pod. But what I always say is it was only done for 4 weeks. They were, however, on a hypocaloric diet, and they weren't resistance training. So when I put it at my bodybuilding goggles on, and I say, okay, well, how do bodybuilders apply it? So we apply it typically, it's not 3 days a week. We typically apply it 5 to 7 days a week at some points, right? We don't do it for just 4 weeks. They typically do it for probably 8, 10, 12, maybe 20 weeks.
Wow.
So, you know, when you kind of look at all of those different assets, you don't just do cardio, you're doing resistance training in addition to. Protein intake was adequate in their study. It's also adequate in the bodybuilders, of course. You may use performance enhancement drugs in the bodybuilding circuit, which might be deleterious to a natural competitor because they might be able to preserve some muscle. So there's a lot of competing, I'm going to say covariates again, that may contribute to some of this. So what I look at is, you know, for the general population, it probably doesn't matter. For bodybuilders, I think I wouldn't say it doesn't work completely. I would say it may not be, it's not better, but it's certainly not detrimental for the most part, unless you're maybe a natural bodybuilder. Then it may be because you're on a caloric deficit. Yeah, when we look at you put that number over time, you know, the difference between first and fifth in a bodybuilding show could be having an extra 3 pounds less body fat, right? Yeah. And being able to do that. So what modalities can we do to do that? So I think there's more that could be investigated there for that particular population only. I would say for the majority of the people, probably doesn't matter. And the other thing that was very interesting in that literature is there was an acute study with that Chad Kirksick did with his group. And they actually looked at what I term protein enhanced cardio. So it's not fasted. It's just let's feed people protein about 30 minutes to an hour before you do that aerobic activity. They gave them whey protein, casein protein, and they look at oxidation rates. And obviously it's got a thermic effect of food, so it's going to naturally increase your metabolism, but they actually oxidize a little more fat in that state. They haven't done a training study on that, but that would be another potential hypothesis. And that may be another, I'm going to say, strategy that could be used by natural bodybuilders to potentially preserve lean body mass and provide the body with the amino acids while doing the aerobic activity.
It could be positive for anybody in Gen Pop trying to lose a little fat and sustain that lean tissue too, right? I mean,
absolutely,
it'd be a very nice approach. Yeah,
absolutely. And the nice thing about it is, I always say, there's also the non-physiological parts of, you know, why you may want to benefit, because again, there's no potential detriment,
right?
Particularly if you're doing the protein component. But to me, it's like, if I know that I can just get up in the morning, most people prefer to lift. They don't necessarily like cardio. So if you're going to skimp on anything in your workouts, probably going to be your cardio. So if you just can get up in the morning, first thing, get that done. Now you're able to kind of, you know, change up your training. Now your training can be kind of focused. I'm going to do my cardio in the morning, and then I'm going to eat a few meals, fuel my body. And then when I really need to focus hard on my lifting, I'm actually going to train, you know, 6 or 8 hours later. Now, again, there's probably some conflicting evidence, or that there's an interference effect or some of this. If you're doing low intensity, probably not. But again, if I'm a bodybuilder and I'm trying to preserve every ounce of lean body mass, you know, why not preserve that muscle mass and spread out my cardio for my resistance training session as much as possible. Awesome. So those are kind of the non-physiological reasons why you may do it. And you don't have to be in the gym as long. You kind of focus on one thing.